the C-SPAN series Presidential Libraries, History Uncovered, visits the Harry S. Truman Presidential Library in Independence, Missouri, and explores the career of our 33rd president.
He'll always be Mr. President to us. He's home folks to us. We're glad to have him, and we're glad to have all of you here to greet him tonight. Welcome home, neighbors.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. I can't tell you how very much Mrs. Truman and I appreciate this reception. It is magnificent. I never expected it. Therefore, it's more to the heart than I anticipated it would be. There's not much that I can say to you, except that your good feeling and your thought of us is always highly appreciated. We're back home now for good. I'm in the army of the unemployed now, although it's a very small army, and I'm here to tell you that a little later on, when I get the job done that Mrs. Truman has for me, which she says I'm going to have to do, that's to unpack all our goods and chattels. And it took about 7 or 8 men 3 months to get it done, so I don't know how long it's going to take one man to get it undone. After that, I'll be open for dinner engagements and things of that kind, because I may be hungry for that time. We do thank you immensely for this wonderful welcome. I don't see how anybody in the world could have a better one. Thank you very much.
You're watching footage of Harry Truman's January 21st, 1953 return to his hometown of Independence, Missouri following his presidency, a town where he lived and worked for the remainder of his life. That's a picture of Harry Truman on the wall right outside of his working office inside the Presidential Library in Independence, Missouri. He was often the first in the door in the library in the morning, and he even answered the phones. Tonight we'll hear from President Truman himself in rarely seen outtakes from a 1960s television series on his presidency, and we'll go behind the scenes into the library stacks where President Truman's papers are preserved for posterity. Richard Norton Smith, presidential historian, what's this program going to focus on tonight?
Well, tonight we are going to learn about the patron saint of political underdogs and embattled presidents, a man who during his presidency was consistently written off, a man who enjoyed, if that can be the word, some of the lowest poll ratings, and who has had an extraordinary posthumous rediscovery, not only by historians, but by the American people. And that in itself is a remarkable story.
Why does President Truman matter?
Truman matters for a number of reasons. Historically, he matters because in many ways he's the architect of the world that we live in, the post-war world. There's a debate going on over who won the Cold War. The fact of the matter is it never would have been waged if Harry Truman had not committed this country. And then he reconstructed the presidency to reflect that fact. If you think of the Department of Defense, if you think of the National Security Council, the Central Intelligence Agency, the Marshall Plan, NATO, all of those are Truman-era creations. So it was an extraordinarily fertile period in terms of foreign policy. But then there is this other, actually symbolized by what we just saw in Independence. There is Mr. Citizen. There is the idea of the citizen politician going home, no Secret Service protection, no pensions, no big speaking fees. He did sign a book contract, but after he published the 2 volumes, he figured and paid his research assistants, he made all of $37,000.
This is the third in a series of 12 Presidential Library specials about archives. What is it not about?
What it's not about?
In other words, in the sense of this is not end-to-end.
This is not, no, this is not a cradle-to-grave biography of Harry Truman. You could not begin to do justice to Truman in the Truman era. What this is a very selective, and we think, revealing, in some cases surprising, it's a snapshot rather than a scrapbook.
I want to show you on your screen an exterior shot of the library in Independence, Missouri, which is about 12 miles from downtown Kansas City, Missouri. Coming up in just a moment, we'll take you back inside Harry Truman's working office in the library, a place that is not on the public tour. That's on your screen right there. We're going to meet Library Director Mike Devine in just a moment. But first, let's see what Harry Truman himself had to say about his hopes for this institution, which was established in 1957, as we listen to him outside the main museum hall here. This is one of the unaired outtakes, and that's film that's not a part of a series that's called the Decision Series.
This library is not a library. It's an archives building with the idea of keeping the records of the government in an orderly manner. The objective is to obtain microfilm reports on all the presidential papers. It'll take a little while to get that done, but when we do get it done, this place will be the center of the study of the presidency of the United States.
On your screen is the director of the Harry S. Truman Presidential Library, Michael Devine. Good evening, sir. Tell us what's in that office.
Well, good evening, Brian, Richard. Good to have you with us, and great to have the C-SPAN audience with us as well. This is called the working office because Truman worked here. He came in to the office oftentimes 6 days a week. He did writing projects. He worked on this film series that you'll see some information about later on in the program. He needed to earn a living, so he did quite a bit of work here. It's also interesting that Truman moved back to the hometown he'd grown up in, to the same community that he'd lived in almost his entire adult life, moved back to the same home, near the same friends and associates he'd been associated with since he was a small child.
You know, I used the word outtakes earlier this evening, Mike Devine. What is an outtake, and what was the Decision Series that we keep talking about?
Okay, the Decision Series was a series of 26 programs that aired on national TV in 1964. In fact, they were so well received that Truman actually won a film award and was named TV Man of the Year for the series. And these are shots that didn't go right. Either Truman flubbed his lines or had trouble reading something, or for one reason or another they just didn't work. And at the time these things were almost lost. In fact, for about 20 years there was some dispute over the ownership. Some people thought they should just be destroyed since they really didn't have anything to do with the series. I mean, they were things that ended up on the cutting room floor. But they were saved, and eventually they came to the Truman Library with the materials that Truman sent on to the library following his presidency, and after things got cleared up, they were eventually worked on and made available to researchers, and you'll have a chance to see some of those tonight.
This was a 26-week series. Originally started with Mr. Truman with David Susskind, then sold to Screen Gems. Let's look at an outtake, something that's not been seen before, and then we'll come back to Richard Norton Smith.
Scene 3 till 12. Take 1.
On that day, June 24th, 1948, the Republican Convention was nominating a Republican candidate for president to run against me that fall. His name was Thomas E. Dewey.
Would you say at the same time that the blockade of Berlin was very strong?
That nomination took place at the same time that the nomination of the Republican president, or the man for the Republican president, took place.
Well, I would like you to say that the blockade of Berlin was on at the time they had the convention.
Well, I said that June 24th, 1948, the blockade of Berlin was total. And on that day at home, the Republican convention was, didn't I say on that day at home?
I didn't get the blockade of Berlin.
Well, let's do it over again. I don't mind doing it over. Let's do the whole damn thing over. See how it works. Whenever you're ready, we'll holler.
Richard, he seemed like he was enjoying himself. He wasn't, for a guy who had supposedly could be feisty, he was getting along.
Well, yeah, let's do the whole damn thing over again. No, and again, that gets to, I think, part of the Truman of folklore. Truman is a complex man who often appears simple, but there's no doubt that one reason why Harry Truman has this enormous posthumous reputation is because of the contrast between his authenticity and his very lack of polish, which you saw in that clip, and modern politics, which are all stage managed and spin doctored and handled to the point where they're anything but authentic.
This series had a hard time being sold to broadcasters. Does that surprise you?
That doesn't surprise me. Harry Truman was very much out of fashion for a very long time. He left office not a popular president, and in fact, publishers, for example, had trouble interesting readers in books about Harry Truman. And you know when it really changed? It was when his daughter Margaret Truman Daniel published her biography of her father, ironically, the month that he died, in 1972. And that really is what began the explosive interest in Truman.
We're going to show a part of the actual series. It's not a very long clip. It's about 3 minutes. The Give 'em Hell 1948 campaign. What is that? What are we referring to?
Well, Give 'em Hell Harry, of course, is the nickname by which he's been immortalized. It apparently came out of a crowd. Truman was a very feisty, very peppery, partisan orator. He's going around the country on the back of a train, laying into Thomas E. Dewey, and even more into the so-called do-nothing Republican Congress, and having a hell of a time doing it.
If this is the first time you've seen any of our series, the purpose, beyond what's been said already, is for us to try to unlock the vaults of these presidential libraries and to let you see some things that haven't had wide distribution. So keep that in mind as we go through the evening. It's a couple of hours of this. Let's look at one of the clips from the Decision series in the early 60s.
I was in Albuquerque, New Mexico, making a speech on this campaign, and some big-voiced, bull-voiced bird way up in the corner of that 7,000 people auditorium said, "Give 'em hell, Harry." Well, I never gave anybody hell. I just told the truth on these fellows, and they thought it was hell. That's all there was to it. I'm coming out here so you can look at me and hear what I have to say, and then make up your own minds as to whether you believe some of the same things that have been said about your president. I've been in politics a long time, and it makes no difference what they say about you if it isn't so. If they can prove it on you, you're in a bad fix indeed. I know. They've never been able to prove it on me. We've traveled about 8,300 miles. I've made 140 talks and speeches, and I've seen at least 2 million people or more. And I believe that the people are beginning to wake up to the fact that this is a real crusade. It's the people against the special interests, and we've got to fight that out to the end if it takes all its other. At 6 o'clock I was defeated. 10 o'clock I was defeated. 12 o'clock I was defeated. 4 o'clock I'd won the election. And the next morning, the morning after that in St. Louis, there was handed this paper which said, "Dewey defeats Truman." Of course, he wished he had, but he didn't, and that's all there was to it.
I'm glad of this opportunity publicly to congratulate President Truman on his election. There has never been a campaign where a man has shown more personal courage and confidence in the people of the United States. He certainly owes nothing to newspapers, radios, commentators. What he's done, he did himself.
How loud is the voice of the people? In America, loud enough.
Look closely on your screen, you can see one of the boxes of materials and the stacks at the Truman Library. And if you notice right there, it says MacArthur's dismissal. We're going to find out about this in just a moment from Sam Boucher, who is the Harry S. Truman Presidential Library Supervisory Archivist. He's standing back in the stacks. And give us an overview, Sam, about all this.
I'd like to welcome C-SPAN viewers to the Harry S. Truman Library stacks. This is one of two stack areas here at the Truman Library. There's one downstairs behind me. And what we have here are some of the 15 million pages or so of documents that we have from Harry Truman's papers, as well as papers from about 400 other collections in this library. In addition to documents, we have over 100,000 still photographs. We also have a large collection of oral history interview transcripts, interviews with people in the Truman administration, and as well as sound recordings and video. What I'm very excited about showing you here this evening is a document that I have the pleasure of saying that we're opening just this evening for the very first time. And what this document is Harry Truman's own prediction of the 1948 election. This was dictated to George Elsey, who was a White House aide aboard Truman's campaign train, the Ferdinand Magellan, in October 1948, just a few weeks before the 1948 election. And as we can see in the upper left corner there, the word white refers to the number of electoral votes that Truman expected to get in 1948, 340. He was off a little bit. He actually got 303. And black refers to his opponent, Thomas Dewey, who expected to get 108 electoral votes. And as we move across the page to the right, what we see are columns with states. Red refers to the states' rights candidate, Strom Thurmond of South Carolina, and the number of states that Truman expected he would get, and then the actual state-by-state breakdown. Truman was mostly right. He got a few wrong, though, particularly Pennsylvania and New Jersey, which he thought he would win, but he lost to Thomas Dewey.
Sam Rouchet, let me ask you this. At what point in the campaign of 48 did he make this prediction?
This was dictated to George Elsey aboard the campaign train in October, mid-October. So this is about 3 weeks before the 1948 campaign. This was at a time when polls across the country unanimously, almost unanimously, predicted that Truman would lose the 1948 election. Experts throughout the country believed it. But Truman himself had said all along that he had believed he would win. And what this is interesting is that it proves that it's the first written record that we're aware of that actually on paper backs up Truman's contention that he would win the election.
Who actually made those figures on that paper?
A man named George Elsey, who donated this document to us just a couple of years ago, and we're just now opening for the very first time this evening. This is a very interesting, exciting document, but it's actually written in George Elsey's handwriting, and Truman dictated to him aboard the train.
Richard Norton Smith here in our studios in Washington. We're going to see some video now from back at the decision series, and give us an idea of what the controversy is around this, because we're going to hear Harry Truman use the N-word.
We are, actually, I think twice in the course of the evening. Ostensibly, this is Truman discussing the 48 campaign and his relationship with FDR, and a third party named Joe Kennedy, whom neither FDR nor Truman neither were very fond. But no doubt, I think the audience will be startled, if not shocked, by a racial slur. And we're going to be talking a little bit about Truman's civil rights record, which is actually quite extraordinary. Arguably, he put civil rights on the national agenda. But remember, he's a product of his time and place. David McCullough said, in many ways, he was a 19th century man. In small-town Missouri, which is where he grew up in the 19th century, on Memorial Day, the reunions were of Confederate troops. His mother and other members of his family were unreconstructed Lincoln haters, and that's the culture in which Harry Truman was brought up. And he never entirely sloughed it off. Mrs. Truman, there's a famous story, of course, about a friend who went up to her and said, "Can't you get Harry to stop using the word manure?" And Mrs. Truman said, "You don't understand how long it took me to get him to use that word." And so Harry Truman's language may shock modern sensibilities, but his conduct is worth exploring as we will later on.
This is about 3 minutes and 30 seconds. Let's watch.
And he got to the point, though, he'd call me up and ask me to come down to the White House, and I'd go down there. And I'd say, Mr. President, what's on your mind? And he'd say, so-and-so over here is upsetting the apple cart. We're trying to do something with him without ourselves upsetting the apple cart. I want you to get after him. Well, I'd usually get after him and we'd straighten him out. He didn't have to do anything, only just have somebody say that good-for-nothing Truman's going to come and investigate you, and then they'd do the right thing. And that's all there was to it. I had inherited the presidency in 1945 in April when Franklin Roosevelt died. And now the next election was coming up. I was very certain that I could be nominated, although a great many people didn't think I could. And I was certain that after the nomination I could be elected. But with all this hornet's nest stirred up about integration and the situation with the nigger people being against me because I was for them and the white people being against me because I was for the niggers, I was really up against a situation that nobody thought would come out. But I made up my mind that I was going to show them what could be done. So as soon as the conventions were over, I organized a program to travel from one end of the country to the other. I went from Seattle, Washington to Key West, Florida, and from Los Angeles, California to Maine, and stopped in every state on the way and every little town that was possible to have a meeting. And that was possible from 5 o'clock in the morning until 11 o'clock at night. I held one meeting in northeastern Colorado at 11 o'clock at night with 5,000 people there. And where they came from, I don't know, because very few people live in that corner of Colorado. And I've had meetings beginning at New Orleans from 5 o'clock on, all day long, every day, from way across Texas to the southern part of California, north on the western coast of California to Seattle, and from Seattle on the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railroad to St. Paul, and from St. Paul to New York, stopping at every city on the way. When I got to Boston, I was put up at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel there, and who should I meet in that hotel room but Mr. Kennedy, who immediately began to cuss Roosevelt and tell me what a bad man he was, and I told the old man that Roosevelt had made him. He'd made him ambassador to Great Britain, and I'd endorsed it. And he had to quit his talk, or I'd throw him out the window. Well, he's a little bit of a squirt, and I could have done it. But Bob Hanneman got me by the arm, said, "Come on out of there, Mr. President. I'm going to get a contribution out of the old so-and-so." And he did. He got a contribution for the Democratic Party. But I never saw him after that. And I didn't hold that against his son when it came time for me to work for him in 1952. But it wasn't very pleasant with me because I was as fond of Franklin Roosevelt as one man could be of another. And I didn't want anything to happen that would in any way make it look like I was ungrateful to him.
Mike Devine again is standing in the office of Harry Truman at the library. Any comment on what we just saw?
Well, I think we have to keep in mind that, as Richard said, he was a man of the 19th century. At the time he makes these programs, he's nearly 80 years old, and from time to time reverted back to old speech patterns that he may have developed in the first 30 years of his life. He probably never heard the word Negro, certainly not African American, used in the Missouri he grew up in. And in this particular instance also, I think if you listen carefully, he's really sort of quoting others. Certain white people thought I was doing too much for, and then he uses the N-word. So looking in the context, and again, it's certainly not politically correct by our standards today.
Let's go back to Sam Rouchet, who's in the stacks. And what do you have for us now?
I'd like to share with you a document that I think really illustrates the relationship between Harry Truman and Franklin Roosevelt. And what's interesting about this document is that it is very deferential in tone, first of all, This is a handwritten note from Harry Truman to Franklin Roosevelt. It's dated April 5th, 1945. This is just 1 week before Franklin Roosevelt died, and Vice President Truman became president. And I'll read a little of it to you to give you an illustration of their kind of a distant relationship. Dear Mr. President, hope you are having a good rest. Hate to bother you, but I have a suggestion to make. Why don't you make Frank Walker Federal Loan Administrator and make Bob Hannigan Postmaster General? Seems to me this would make everybody happy. In addition to illustrating the relationship, I think it also shows some of Vice President Truman's priorities in terms of rewarding Mr. Walker and Mr. Hannigan, who had been important allies of Truman's the year before in 1944 in that campaign, and were very instrumental in causing Harry Truman to become vice president in the first place, and in effect dumping Henry Wallace, who was the sitting vice president.
Richard, that was April 5th when that note was written, and President Roosevelt dies 10 days later, whatever it is. And then a tremendous amount happens that year. Put that in. We're going to look at some Potsdam footage here in just a minute.
Harry Truman called the first volume of his memoirs A Year of Decisions, and that's what 1945 was. It's as if history sped up. The day he became president, he had to decide, do we go ahead with the organizing conference of the United Nations in San Francisco that's due to open in 2 weeks that President Roosevelt was going to address. He discovers for the first time something called the Manhattan Project, which of course will lead to the decision about dropping atomic bombs in Hiroshima.
He knew nothing about that.
He knew nothing about it. No one had told him. You know, he only had 2 meetings with FDR during his 82 days as vice president. That doesn't mean he was particularly left out in the cold. That's how vice presidents were treated. But he took office knowing nothing about the Manhattan Project, knowing very little about President Roosevelt's blueprint for post-war life.
The war in Europe was over when?
The war in Europe was in its last days. Hitler would commit suicide in less than 3 weeks, and within a month, the formal surrender, VE Day, would take place. The problem, of course, was the disposition of Eastern Europe and occupied Germany, which would be major topics at the Potsdam Conference, and no one thought that the war in Japan was going to end for some time to come. So Japan and Eastern Europe, and much of it now occupied by the Soviet armies, and pledges that had been made about democratic elections at the Yalta Conference just a few months earlier, this formed the agenda for the conference at Potsdam.
President Roosevelt was at Yalta, but President Truman was at Potsdam along with Stalin and along with Winston Churchill. You can see that on your screen right now. Potsdam's right outside of Berlin. Let's look at about 5 minutes from the outtakes of decisions.
Negotiating with Stalin was like dealing with an octopus. And when we were at Yalta, at Potsdam after that, which was intended to implement the 16 agreements that were made at Yalta, we negotiated with the Russians around the table, Great Britain, the United States, and Stalin, or Russia, sat around a big round table. I've got a picture of it in the library out there. Sometime when you're out there, I'll show it to you. At any rate, when we were in the midst of the negotiations about Poland, Mr. Churchill made the statement that the Pope would be very much disgruntled if Poland didn't have a free government. And Mr. Stalin leaned on his elbow and pulled his mustache like this, and turned around to me and said in Russian, which was immediately translated by my interpreter, "How many divisions has the Pope?" Which was a characteristic situation with regard to the Russians. If you have more divisions than I have, I'll agree to I'll carry out the agreements that I have made with you. If you haven't, you better look out. And that was where we learned that it was necessary for us to be stronger all the time than the Eastern Bloc made up of Russia and China. So we negotiated the treaties with these free countries, and that's known as NATO. And it has so far kept the peace in Europe. I was the first one to arrive. Winston Churchill was the second one to arrive. He came the day after I arrived. And Stalin was 2 days later. I heard afterwards that Stalin had had a slight heart attack. I didn't find out about it until he had arrived and told me what the trouble was. But each one of us gave a state dinner in turn. I gave the first one, Mr. Churchill gave the second one, and Stalin gave the third one. Stalin's dinner, he kept drinking out of a bottle. Everybody else was drinking vodka, or trying to. It's hard to get down, you know, if you're not used to it. At any rate, I turned around to him and I said, "That must be a different brand you're drinking." He had a little glass about the size of a thimble. I reached over and took his bottle and poured it in my vodka glass after it was empty, and it was French wine. He wasn't drinking vodka at all. And I said, "You're putting one over on us, aren't you?" "Oh, well," he says, "you know, my heart won't stand this heavy drinking, and I have to go slowly." Well, you know, the Russians never put on a dinner without a whole raft of toasts. At the Russian state dinner at Potsdam, they had 14 toasts. And I learned early in the game not to take a drink every time they offered a toast, but just back out like you're taking one, because you would be unable to carry on the business of the meeting. It was an education in itself to be dealing with two brilliant men such as Winston Churchill and Stalin. And they were representing Great Britain and Russia. We had hoped that Russia would get into the Japanese War on our side. Russia didn't come into the Japanese War until after the bombs had been dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They saw immediately that Japan was going to surrender, and they wanted to be in to kill. And they came in just about 3 days before the Japanese surrendered. And they caused us so much trouble at Yalta and at the Western European surrender that I made it a point that they would have a representative at the Japanese surrender, but they would have nothing to say about what took place. We didn't have any trouble with them, with the Japanese. We got the thing straightened out the way we wanted it and carried it through to the end. But if the Russians had been able to get in there, they'd have caused us just as much trouble in Japan as they did in Europe. But they didn't have a chance. That's the only reason they didn't do it. We made 48 agreements altogether. 32 at Potsdam and 16 at Yalta on the peace of the world. And the Russians agreed to every single one of those agreements, made a written record of their agreement to every one of those 48 agreements, and they broke every one of them. I don't know what the hell you're going to do when an outfit won't keep its agreement.
On your screen is a live picture of the Truman Library in Independence, Missouri. What you saw there, an outtake, is something that's not shown as a part of a series because they taped a lot of conversations with Harry Truman before they made these 26-part series back in the 60s. And Eric Nelson researched all this for us by going to the libraries and working with people like Sam Richey, who's going to be on your screen here in just a moment, to show us something again that no one, I guess this is this an item that's just declassified?
Yes, Brian, it is. In addition to the donated materials that we open periodically, such as that document I showed you from the Elsie papers a few minutes ago about the vote tally, we also have declassified documents that we periodically are able to open to the public. And this is an example of a document we opened earlier this week, along with 1,400 pages of other declassified documents from our, in this case, from our Psychological Strategy Board files. The Psychological Strategy Board was a government organization that was made up of Department of State representatives, Department of Defense representatives, and others that were involved with, as the name suggests, psychological operations around the world. And what we found notable about this document is that in it, it suggests that President Truman, in a press conference, spread false stories about the Soviet Union. This is dated January 1952. These officials that wrote this document are trying to look beyond Joseph Stalin, who was the leader of the Soviet Union. And as Mr. Truman had said in the recent segment, it was known that Stalin's health was questionable. And what this suggestion is that Truman tried to destabilize the Soviet Union and weaken the Soviet Union by spreading false stories about their leadership.
Sam, why did it take 55 years to declassify this?
Well, that's a good question, Brian. Declassification is a complex world, and whatever federal agencies were interested in this document only recently decided that it could be declassified and open to the public. It can seem a little mysterious at times.
You know, I'm just wondering, I'd be fascinated to know, Sam, do you have any idea what President Truman's response to this document was?
Well, Richard, we don't have any evidence that President Truman actually read this document. It was in his papers, but there are no notes on it, no indication that Truman actually read it. But I think what's significant about it is the suggestion that Truman do this, to spread the false stories in a press conference. Now, that was not Truman's style. You know, of course, he was a pretty frank person, and it wasn't his style to do this, and he did not do it in this press conference. Stalin, as you know, would live on for over another year and died a month or two after Truman left office.
By the way, Harry Truman lived right up the street, walked down to that library every day, as we continue to show you some of the outtakes never before seen on television of his conversations for this program, Decisions. And here's one that's about 3 minutes or so, Harry Truman talking about the atomic bomb.
Well, nobody else can make a decision but me, because I was the president, and the final decision comes to the president, you know. I used to have a sign on my desk that said, "The buck stops here." The buck stops at the president's desk when he's president of the United States, and he either makes the decisions or he lets them go by default, and you can't afford to do that when you're president. It was possible that the number of atomic bombs we had might not bring the complete surrender of all the Japanese troops scattered from Japan to the South Pacific. But it was better to have an agreement with them, because we no longer felt that we had to kowtow to the Russians in negotiating. We had the strength, and it's my opinion that we ought to use it, and we did. There are reasons why there were almost 100,000 casualties instead of the 20,000 which we anticipated. First of all, there was no air signal given. A lot of people were going to work at that moment, but most of all, it was just after breakfast time, and the coals of the brazier stoves that the Japanese used were still glowing. When they turned over, there were simultaneous fires all over the city. They tell me it looked like 100% 4th of July on one whole town. That message I received was headed by code message, which said, "Baby successfully born." That meant to me that the atomic bomb had been a success. And then they went on and explained the whole thing in plain English, and I don't know why in the world they couldn't have said that in the first place.
Did you say the word "baby satisfactorily born" totally afterwards?
Baby satisfactorily born is what the thing said. But I didn't give a damn about that. What I was interested in is to know whether the bomb went off or not, and that's what it meant. There are such things as the fortunes of war. Dr. Tsumi Sino, who was the dean of the Nagasaki College, was in Hiroshima when the bomb was dropped there. He lived through it. Then he went over to Nagasaki and got killed by the next bomb that was dropped. man's problem is himself. The world was created, and man was placed on it, and he could not create the world, but he can destroy it. And that's what we have to watch out for all the time. Be sure that in our enthusiasm to show off how much we know, we don't explode the whole world. I was very much afraid that these atomic bombs, which we dropped on Japan, might set the whole world afire, and then where would we have been?
Richard, you went to Hiroshima?
Hiroshima 2 years ago. It was an extraordinarily moving experience. One very small thing, just to make sure that viewers aren't confused. That clip where Truman talks about getting that message, baby satisfactorily born, that is not, now Mike can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that is not a reference to either of the bombs at Hiroshima or Nagasaki. That was the message that Truman received on the way back from the Potsdam Conference from the first successful testing of the device at Alamogordo, New Mexico.
Mike Devine is back in the office, and he's got a map there of Japan. What is that map, Mr. Devine?
This is a really fascinating item. This is a map marked top secret that was used in the secret map room of the White House, on the lower level of the White House, throughout the Second World War. And this is the room where President Roosevelt, General Marshall, Admiral Leahy, frequently Winston Churchill would stay for weeks at a time plotting strategy. Truman didn't know this room even existed until after he became president of the United States. This particular map shows the plan for the invasion of the Japanese home islands, with points number 1, secure the Trans-Siberian Railroad at Vladivostok. Point number 2 down here, seize objectives between the Philippines and Japan, which would have included the island of Taiwan. There's also notes on the side indicating the estimated amount of gasoline, the number of minesweepers, the number of mine layers, the number of railroad cars and railroad track that would have to be laid to stage the invasion of the home islands. One of the things that's fascinating, they also estimate the troop strength of the Japanese army, and we have to keep in mind in the final month of the war, the Japanese not only held on to their home islands, but also all of Korea, Manchuria, much of eastern China, Indochina, the Dutch East Indies or Indonesia, parts of Burma. So there were huge armies on the mainland of Asia that had never experienced defeat at the time Truman decided to use the atomic bombs.
We're going to come back to Mike Devine in a few minutes, look around the office some more. That's the office that Harry Truman used when he was at the library, and he lived about, I think, roughly about 19 years after he came back to the City of Independence, and he spent 15 years in that office because the library started 50 years ago this year, 1957. As we've been showing you some outtakes of the series on decisions, that's film that was used or taped, or not taped, film that was shot with Harry Truman but not used in the series. Here's an actual produced segment that was about war crimes, and then we're going to go to phones. So those of you pay attention to those lines on the screen that want to participate. We'll have about 10 minutes of phones, and we'll get some of your questions answered.
Moscow, 1943. The Allies said that war criminals whose acts cannot be localized geographically because they affect several countries will be punished by common decision.
Later, at Tehran, Stalin offered a toast to the punishment of all war criminals. And he said that there were at least 50,000 of them. I also offer a toast to the firing squad, he said. 4 days after I became president, I told Congress my objective. The laws of God and of man have been violated, and the guilty must not go unpunished. Nothing shall shake our determination to punish the war criminals, even though we must pursue them to the ends of the earth.
Pursued they were. Punished they should be for what our GIs were beginning to see with their own eyes. Crime as old as time, but with new names for the times. Belsen, Dachau, Buchenwald.
Punishment should not be meted out without a trial. The trial was what I was fighting for. I wanted to make it impossible for anybody to say that this was just a lot of propaganda, that it didn't happen, that it was a pack of lies. I wanted to fix it so things would be down in black and white, and the evidence would be available for future generations, just like it was to us. That was the reason I wanted trials. I wanted to see that these atrocities, such as this, were punished. I was very much surprised to get the word from Judge Rosenman. It shocked me, the message that he gave me. I discussed the question of the trial of war criminals with Mr. Churchill and with members of the War Cabinet. They wanted to treat the war criminals as a political matter. This is the way they treated Napoleon himself. I didn't want the same thing to happen to Hitler that happened to Napoleon Bonaparte. You see, Hitler was called the Beast of Berlin. Napoleon was called the Ogre of Corsica. He was exiled on the island of St. Helena, and it gave him an opportunity to make a hero out of himself by writing his viewpoint of what took place. I didn't want that same thing to happen to Hitler. I didn't want Hitler to have a chance to be made a hero by future generations, because he was anything but that. He was the greatest murderer in the history of the world. Well, I thought the leaders should be punished in proportion to the terrible crimes they had committed. But I didn't think you ought to be just rounded up and shot without a trial. That is just plain revenge. And time was of the essence. We were showering Germany with leaflets, warning the Germans we'd hold them responsible for further crime, promising they'd be ruthlessly brought to punishment. But we still didn't have an agreement on how that was going to be done. There's a good old American saying that you have to catch a skunk before you can skin him. Well, the time was getting closer when we expected to catch that skunk and skin him. Then at the end, all the Allies saw what Hitlerism boiled down to. Corpses, dead people, piled in rows, just like cordwood. I knew what war was, but it had never been like this. And I was determined, if it was the last thing I ever did, to let the whole world know just exactly what had been happening.
Richard Norton Smith, there's Winston Churchill meeting Harry Truman. How'd they get along?
They get along fine. Churchill made an admission to Harry Truman late in life. He said, you know, the first time I met you, Mr. President, at Potsdam, I resented you for taking Franklin Roosevelt's place. I was wrong, and I realize that you've done more than any other man to preserve and protect human freedom. They became actually quite close friends. And Truman, in 1956, went to Europe, had a wonderful time, and he visited Churchill at Chartwell. That was the last time that they got together.
This is a snapshot of Harry Truman and his library and his archives, and we're going to take some calls till the top of the hour. Then we'll break and come back and do another hour of this tonight. We'll go to Chicago, Illinois first up. Go ahead, Chicago. You're on the air.
Yes, perhaps your C-SPAN audience would like these short quotes.
We moved some naval ships into the Persian Gulf, and I ordered a division or two to be sent to eastern Syria and the northern part of Iran.
And then again, from his inauguration, Harry Truman wanted universal health care and had difficulties in getting it.
Thanks.
In fact, there's a wonderful sequel. You're absolutely right. One way we judge our presidents is not only by what they accomplish in office, but what they set in motion. And you're absolutely right, Harry Truman could not get Congress to enact a universal health care program. In 1965, Lyndon Johnson went to the Truman Library, having just succeeded in getting Medicare enacted, and he gave President and Mrs. Truman card number 1 and card number 2. He signed the Medicare bill in the auditorium of the Truman Library in recognition of the fact that it was Harry Truman who really began that cause.
Richard Norton Smith, presidential historian, is here with all these programs in our studio in Washington, and we have Jim Clark and his crew from C-SPAN out in Independence at the Truman Library. Fairfield, Connecticut, you're on the air. Go ahead, please.
Yes. Good evening.
Hi.
Thank you very much. It's a wonderful series. Hello?
Go ahead. You're on the air.
My question is, how much did Mr. Truman know about the president's illness at the time? You said he didn't know about the Hiroshima. How much did he know about the president's illness? Please?
Mike Devine, do you have an answer to that?
Well, it's hard to know for certain, but clearly Truman saw Roosevelt as being in poor health. After the election and the inauguration, Truman only met with Roosevelt a couple of times, and at those times other people were present. He was at a luncheon at the White House with Roosevelt, where Roosevelt's hand was shaking so badly he couldn't pour the cream into his coffee, and one of the waiters had to pour the cream for the president. Truman reported on that in a letter to his wife, Bess. But I think Truman, like everyone else, felt that Roosevelt was suffering from the strain of the presidency, maybe a little rest, a few weeks off, a trip to Warm Springs, and the commander-in-chief would recover a bit of his strength.
Lakeland, Florida. Go ahead, please.
Yes, Brian?
Yes, sir.
I remember something, I was only about 7, but I remember something around the 48 election that Truman had some association, or was accused of having some association with organized crime family of Kansas City. I just wondered if there was any truth to that, and if they could enlighten me on that.
Sam Ruchet, do you have any answer to that?
Well, I think it's certainly true that President Truman's political origins were with the Irish Catholic machine of Tom Pendergast of Kansas City, who did, of course, have some shadowy business dealings and some possibly illegal activities involved with Pendergast's activities. But there's never been any evidence that Harry Truman himself was involved in any illegal activities. But throughout his campaigns, from precinct to president, Truman was hounded by the Pendergast specter. And it continued even into his presidency, as his political opponents were sure that his connection with Pendergast and his rise connected to Pendergast must mean that Truman himself was guilty of something.
Patterson, New Jersey. Good evening.
Yes, to continue on that particular idea, in the 44 Democratic Convention, Henry Wallace was elected on the first ballot, and they wouldn't allow Claude Pepper to second the nomination. And they put, the next day they put Truman in power. This is when we became a national security state. And I'd like the American people to know that we have been duped ever since with this Cold War. Because if anybody would watch the book written by Carolyn Eisenberg, which was Drawing the Line, it states distinctly that Roosevelt did not want to deal with Churchill. He didn't even want to invite him to Tehran in the conference, because the conference between Stalin and Roosevelt was to unite Germany under the four powers and pay Russia $20 billion in war reparations. And when Truman came into power with the same Liberty Leaguers that tried to create a dictatorship in this country by putting General Smedley Butler in Roosevelt's seat, the same people that are running the country now and have destroyed this country with a Cold War and used American troops for...
Carl, I'm going to let you go because you could go on for a long time with this. And Richard...
well, it's interesting. Henry Wallace had been Roosevelt's second vice president. And the fact is, there are a lot of people in the party, led by some of the big city bosses and others, who looked at FDR's health, and they concluded that whoever was vice president on that ticket almost certainly would win the presidency. And they did not want Henry Wallace in part for what they saw as his left-wing politics. And Harry Truman was certainly someone much closer to the, to the middle of the road.
Greenville, Pennsylvania, you're on the air.
Hi.
Hi. Go ahead, please.
Oh, hi. I was asked a question about this. Okay, I was wondering if there's any indication that President Truman had ever became aware.
You're going to have to please get to the point because you haven't turned your television set down.
Sorry, I'm sorry. I was wondering if President Truman was ever aware of the fact that Stalin had murdered and imprisoned more people than Hitler had.
Michael Devine.
Yeah, I think certainly Truman knew that Stalin was a tough, brutal dictator. I think at the end of the war, Truman wanted to continue a policy of cooperation, keep the Grand Alliance together, but over a period of months, he realized that wasn't going to be possible, and the Cold War resulted.
Mike Devine, how long have you run the library and the museum?
6 years. Been here since 2001.
St. Louis, Missouri, you're next. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, I noticed on the bottom of your screen it says Harry S. Truman, and the S has a period behind it. It was my understanding that the S actually is his middle name, that he had no name except for S, and the period would be an abbreviation for
somebody's name. Yeah, thanks. What do you think, Sam Richer?
We've had a lot of questions on this subject, Brian, over the years, and it was not uncommon in the Missouri of Truman's time for children to be named with a middle initial that did not stand for any specific name. The S was considered a compromise between Truman's maternal grandfather and his paternal grandfather, Anderson Shipp Truman on his paternal side, and Solomon Young on his maternal side, his two grandfathers.
Should there be a period there then?
Well, that's been a subject of some controversy too. The National Archives recognizes the period because Harry Truman typically used the period in his correspondence. Almost invariably, when he had when he typed his name, he used a period. But it's been said that that's not proper because the S does not stand for any specific name. For example, the National Park Service that runs the Truman home down the street does not recognize the period after the S.
Let's go to New Orleans, Louisiana next. Good evening. You're on the air.
Yes, I did a master's thesis some 40 years ago on Truman and his press conferences. And I did some of my research there at the Truman Library, and I had the good fortune to meet him. He was well up in years at that time, but what I wanted to tell was a little story. We were sitting on the couch in his outer office, and I had been going through these press conferences, and he had had some prickly moments with the press. And the thing that had struck me, though, as I was doing my research, was the awe in which he himself held the presidency of the United States. And so I had asked him, well, Mr. President, can you tell me, do you think the press abused you when you were President of the United States? And he looked at me, and he said, no. He said, they can't abuse the President of the United States. And then he poked me in the leg with his forefinger, and he said, I'll tell you one thing, though. There were a hell of a lot of them who would have if they could have.
Thank you, caller. Richard Norton Smith.
I mean, that is pure Truman, you know. The distinction between a man who had a very modest view of himself. I mean, he really distinguished between himself and this office that he temporarily occupied. And again, that's part of, I think, what so many people find very appealing about Truman in retrospect.
Last call for this segment, we got another hour to go, is Flippin, Arkansas. You're on the air.
Hi, Brian.
Hi.
I was born and raised in Kansas City, Missouri, and born and raised Democrat, and I think Harry Truman's why I became a Republican. All my dad, being a staunch Democrat, all he could do was ridicule and talk against the Democrats and Harry Truman. Things like who was the reporter that ridiculed his daughter singing?
Paul Hume?
Pardon me?
Paul Hume of the Washington Post?
No, he had three names, the reporter did. But anyhow, he called, Harry Truman called him an SOB. I mean, he just did a lot of unpresidential things which you don't hear about now. And a lot of people didn't respect him. They didn't hold him up as presidential material.
All right, thank you. That's it for our first hour. We're going to take a break, and we'll be right back.
For more historic footage and other exclusive materials, go online to our special website at cspan.org/presidential libraries. As part of the Presidential Library series, C-SPAN Radio will bring you never-before-aired selections of audio-taped interviews with Harry Truman, conducted by historian and author Merle Miller. That's tomorrow at 3 p.m. Eastern on C-SPAN Radio. And next Friday, we'll be live from the Eisenhower Presidential Library in Abilene, Kansas. Dwight D. Eisenhower was the first president to use television extensively to communicate with the American public. And during the 2-hour program, we'll examine his use of that emerging medium through archival film recordings. We'll also look at letters, documents, and artifacts from the stacks and vaults of the library. And we'll take your calls next Friday at 8 p.m. Eastern on C-SPAN. Now, we continue with the C-SPAN series Presidential Libraries, History Uncovered, as we visit the Harry S. Truman Presidential Library in Independence, Missouri, and explore the career of our 33rd president.
Welcome back to our second hour on Harry Truman. You're looking at a film of Mr. Truman here in his hometown of Independence, Missouri, right outside of Kansas City. This archival film and everything else we're showing you tonight comes from the Truman Presidential Library's collection, a collection we hope will add some insight into people's understanding of our nation's 33rd president. It's now back to his working office there in the library. He spent some 15 years in that office. And Truman Library Director Michael Devine is in the office and going to show us some things there either on the desk or whatever. Go ahead, Michael.
Okay, Brian, I'll be happy to show you around a little bit. This is very much Truman's personal office. The items on his desk were of great personal importance to him. One of my favorite items is this picture. You notice I have my white curator's gloves on here. This is a picture of Bess Truman that Bess gave to Harry after they were engaged, and President Truman, as a soldier, as a captain in the Missouri National Guard, went off to France. Bess told Harry to bring the picture back with him safely, which he did, and he kept it on his desk as a county judge, as a United States Senator, Vice President, President, and in his retirement years. You can see the frame on the picture is a little bit worn, and probably he could have got a new frame for it, but being the kind of guy he was, why buy a new frame when you could just get some paper clips and hold the thing together that way?
Michael Devine, is that the way the desk looked the day that he died?
Absolutely. In fact, the clock is set at 7:50 a.m. and the calendar is at Tuesday, December 26, 1972, the exact day that Truman died.
And he's buried right behind you there outside that window there. Was that what he wanted?
Right. According to the story, he was sitting at his desk one day looking out through the windows, which were open then, out of the courtyard, and commented on how beautiful the courtyard looked, and said that when the time came he wanted to be buried at the library out in the courtyard. He said that way he could keep an eye on the library and make sure that future directors were doing an okay job. So far he hasn't said anything to me, so I guess I'm okay.
He was 88 when he died. How long, much longer after he died, did his wife live, and is she buried there with him?
Right. She's also buried in the courtyard next to Harry, and she lived for another 10 years.
Richard Norton-Smith, back to some of the outtakes. Again, what is an outtake?
This is film that was shot as part of this decision series in the early 60s, but not actually used, not actually incorporated into the broadcast. And this has sat in the vaults ever since.
What are we going to see now?
Well, we're going to see, actually, there are a couple of clips here. One is the 1948 campaign. We've sort of danced around the 48 campaign a little bit. This is a wonderful scene of Truman gently and not so gently ribbing his detractors in the press, and above all, a once famous, now largely forgotten radio commentator named H.V. Kaltenborn, and his particular reporting symptomatic of the media establishment that universally believed that Harry Truman was going to lose the election.
Let's watch.
Scene 314, take one.
I had long ago made up my mind to run for re-election because I had a program that had to be put over. And when Dewey was nominated, that made me all the more anxious to beat him, and I did. And then people were waiting. Europe waited. The Russians waited. Everybody was dissatisfied. I was satisfied that the thing was not going to work. The Kremlin was silent, and people were wondering just what I would do as President of the United States. And when I found out that that was the case, I made up my mind I was going to stay there the second term and show them, which we did. In the 1948 election, I was reelected. Reelected in spite of the fact that I had asked for a civil rights bill, had recognized Israel, and what else was it I did?
Demanding integration.
And demanding the integration of the armed forces, and I didn't do any good on that at all.
No, that's fine. Just tell us that the three things you did: recognizing Israel, requesting civil rights legislation, and demanding integration.
Recognizing Israel, requesting the civil rights legislation, and causing the integration of the armed forces, demanding the integration of the armed forces.
Cut.
1918, in Alsace, when my battery went out of fire for the first time, the first sergeant came riding up and said, "Run, fellas, run. They've got a bracket on us." A few German shells had been falling around us, and all of them ran away, but 5 or 6 of us. And my horse stepped in a shell hole and rolled over me when it fell down. When I got up and found out what had happened to the fellows around the battery, I explained a few things to them in language that they could understand. In fact, I took the skin off of them when I got through with them. And I would like very much to be able to talk to the Congress in that frame of mind and with that sort of language, but it can't be done. Congress don't give you a chance to talk to them unless you want to go down formally and deliver a message.
You misstated.
I did. There's an outtake I wish we could take back, but you can't do that on live TV. In fact, I tell you, I think it's on the website. If you go to the website for this series, you can see H.V. Kaltenborn's, or Harry Truman's memorable impersonation of H.V. Kaltenborn. The irony, of course, of that second clip, he's talking about Congress. He ran against the so-called do-nothing Congress in 1948 to great effect. The irony, of course, is that it was that Congress that gave him much of his foreign policy program, including the Marshall Plan and other, the foundation of Cold War policies.
This is trivia, but I always like to try to stump you. Can you tell me what HV of the H.V. Kaltenborn stands for?
No, I don't think I can.
Hans von Kaltenborn.
I know it was German, but
30 years CBS reporter. Sam Rouchet, introduce us to your colleague there.
Sure, Brian. I have the pleasure of introducing Liz Safley, our librarian, who has worked here since the time when Harry Truman was coming to the library. Liz, can you tell us about the very exciting discovery you made in 2003?
Well, I can. We discovered in this kind of nondescript real estate book that there was a Harry Truman diary, pretty extensive, actually. And Sam and I have chosen a paragraph from the end here and on this page that also talks a little bit about the period before the 1948 election. And I'm going to be talking about Ike, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, and MacArthur, General Douglas MacArthur. And Truman has written, and this is July 25th, 1947. Ike and I think MacArthur expects to make a Roman triumphal return to the U.S. a short time before the Republican convention meets in Philadelphia. I told Ike that if he did that, he, Ike, should announce for the nomination for president on the Democratic ticket, and that I'd be glad to be in second place or vice president. I like the Senate anyway. Ike and I could be elected, and my family and myself would be happy outside the great white jail known as the White House.
Liz Safley,
So that's the kind of thing we found in this.
how many diaries do you have of his?
Well, not that many. He was sort of well, not a regular diary writer, but he tended, if he had something on his mind, and I think that's why he would pick up something like this. This is really an appointment book, not a diary, and he'd pretty much pick up anything that was handy and write in it. And this had on it that we found a note inside that it had come from the presidential study, so that was in the residence.
How long did you work with him directly?
Well, I never really worked directly. I was here for 4 years while he was in the library, and he came every day.
What do you remember?
Sometimes on Saturdays. Mm-hmm.
What do you remember about him?
I remember his good humor and that he was funny. And he was very kind to the staff. He was very good to researchers, would always walk through the research room and talk to them, ask them if they were finding what they were looking for, and that they would find it if they just looked through the papers. And also, he loved to go out in the museum and talk to people, and I think it really amazed people that, they'd be going through the museum and here would be the guy himself. So I think we were very lucky for a long time to have him.
You mentioned in the diary Douglas MacArthur. Here's some more outtakes about General MacArthur, Harry Truman talking about him for about 3.5 minutes.
Production 65013, scene 1319, take one. All right. Do you think that the action you took in removing General MacArthur will have any effect on the MacArthurs of another time?
It will have an effect on the military until, if we should accidentally get into another war, and we'll have the same experience, whoever's president, because you'll have a general in that layout that will have the same disposition and the same way to work, and you'll be using MacArthur as an example. Up until that time, we won't have any trouble.
Well, do you think that the general will be using MacArthur as an example, or will he be afraid to do what MacArthur did?
Now, you never can tell. You have to wait and see what kind of a general we've got and what he's trying to do. But you can be sure that if we have another emergency, if we should have another emergency and war should come, you'll find some general, or it doesn't have to be confined to the general, you'll find some general of the Army or general of the Air Force or some admiral of the Navy who think he's bigger than the president. They always do that, and you can't help it. It's happened in every war.
You don't think that he will be frightened by the fact that once a President Truman fired a General MacArthur?
No, he wasn't frightened by what Lincoln did to his four generals.
That General MacArthur's conduct harmed us in Korea?
I'm not sure about that. I haven't given that enough thought to tell you, but whatever it did, it didn't keep us from doing what we had to do in Korea.
You think it stretched out the war any?
It may have. I can't say anything as to that at all, because I'm not in a position to tell you. I don't know. But I know that it didn't help any in Korea. You can be sure of that.
Did you plan to repair your relations with MacArthur by offering him another major assignment?
No, I did not. I was through with him.
Could you tell us what your plan was?
I didn't have any plan. All I wanted to do was to get rid of him and the trouble he was causing me, and I did that, and that's all there was to it.
Do you regard MacArthur as outdated or outmoded for these modern times, his kind of thinking?
No. No, I do not. The handling of a program of that sort, unless the military approach radically changes, it's necessary to have men in charge of these things in the field, and it's necessary to have chiefs of staff who understand what it's all about, who can advise the president on the military situation as it develops. We're talking now as to a case of an emergency, which I hope will never come.
How do you think he handled his Japanese administration? Did he fall behind the times? Was he modern in thinking in that sense?
No, no. He handled his position as the protocol called for, and his position as the commanding general in charge of the troops to see that Japan implemented the treaty that they had signed. He did a good job in Japan.
Back to the office at the library of Harry Truman in his working office. Michael Devine, what do you have for us?
Well, this is an item that was found in President Truman's desk after he died. And let me just show you. This was in the middle desk drawer. It's a Purple Heart medal. And it was sent to Truman after he left the White House in 1953 by a gentleman named William Banning from New Canaan, Connecticut. And with the Purple Heart was this note. It said, "Mr. Truman, as you have been directly responsible for the loss of our son's life in Korea, you might just as well keep this emblem on display in your trophy room as a memory of one of your historic deeds. Our major regret at this time is that your daughter was not there to receive the same treatment as our son received in Korea." And obviously, the decision to send troops to Korea weighed very heavily on the president. He acted very decisively and very quickly in June of 1950, but he always said it was the toughest decision he had to make as president because he knew he would be sending troops into harm's way and that many of them would be killed.
Richard Norton Smith, it sounds a lot like some of our callers when they talk about George Bush and his two daughters.
Well, you know, it's interesting. There's a striking parallel because Harry Truman sort of reinvented the very meaning of the word war. Remember, he didn't call Korea a war. It was a police action. And that was a concept very difficult for Americans who had just been through the greatest war in history to understand. The notion that success was defined by restoring pre-war borders, by containing the spread of communism, was every bit as radical, I would suggest, as the idea of preemptive war is in our own time. It made Truman very unpopular. It's the major reason why he had the lowest approval ratings ever recorded. There may very well be some parallels between then and now.
If you've just joined us, this is a third of 12-part series about presidential libraries. It's really a treasure hunt. We set out with the help of Richard Norton Smith and Eric Nelson and others here, Delia Rios and others. Mark Farkas is our producer and has done all of our history stuff over the years, to find new things that you haven't seen. And it's a snapshot. It's not meant to be a program that, better say, it's meant to intrigue you enough that you might want to go and take a chance at trying to find some new things yourself. I guess is Michael Devine still there? Okay. Mike Devine, are there things in the library that people have never seen because they just don't know they're there or they haven't looked for them?
Well, this is true. I mean, most people who come to the library visit the exhibits, which we completely redid in 2001, but we can only put a small fraction of what we have in the collection on display at any one time. And most people don't get a chance to look at these screen gems outtakes or come back in the research room and work there. But people can find a great many items on our website. We have over 100,000 pages on our websites. People can take virtual tours, look through our finding aids. We have thousands of pictures up there, and so I would encourage people who can't visit the library to look at our website.
Richard Ornsmith, let's change subjects to civil rights.
Yeah, well, again, I said Truman is a complex man who often appears simple on no subject more than this. We talked earlier about him being a product of rural and undoubtedly racist Missouri at the turn of the century. One day he writes a letter to his sister back in Independence and says, I've got to give a speech tomorrow that Mother wouldn't like. It turns out he is the first president to speak to the NAACP. And he goes in front of the Lincoln Memorial. You can see the shot right now, this mass meeting in 1947. And Harry Truman really puts civil rights on the national agenda. He said once, he said, you know, I have Confederate forebears, but my stomach turned over when I heard about Negro soldiers coming back from World War II who were dumped from trucks in Mississippi and beaten to within an inch of their lives. So Truman put anti-lynching onto the nation's agenda, and he really started a national conversation.
Here are about 5 minutes of Harry Truman from more outtakes from the Decision series.
As I stated, I was an artilleryman. When I was 21 years old, I joined the organization of a battery of National Guard field artillery in Kansas City. I couldn't join it before I was 21 because my mother and father were afraid I'd have to wear a blue uniform. I did have to wear a blue uniform, and I liked it. It was pretty, nicest thing you ever saw. I've got a picture in it somewhere. I wore it out to see my old red-haired grandmother who had her farm burned down and her hogs killed and stolen and everything else by the federal soldiers. And she looked at me over her spectacles like that and says, Harry, that's the first time a uniform of that color has been in this house since the Civil War. Don't bring it back. I didn't. The act of treason was not only on the side of the niggers. For years and years, the white people had been practically treasonable for the simple reason that they wouldn't give all the citizens of the country civil rights. The Emancipation Proclamation of 1868 freed the slaves, all right, but it didn't free the American people. It was a long, long time before the white people of the United States and their children could bring themselves to believe that the freed slaves were had equal rights in the country with them.
Emancipation Proclamation 1868? Was it 1860?
1868. That's the 13th and 14th Amendments been in the Constitution since 1868 and never has been enforced until just comparatively recently.
Okay. If you'll come up to the screen.
Back of this coat is off the one. Volume is full back.
Excuse me.
Sure.
Move you on your way back.
Thank
Pull
you.
that curtain down. Will you on the right? Yes, that's it. Okay. Good. Thank you.
All right, sir.
A Ku Klux Klan officer in 1923 told me that if I didn't promise to appoint all Catholics to county offices when I had the opportunity to do it, the Klan would fight me to a finish. I blew up. I told him where to go and where to get off. And then went on and fought the election just the same.
822, take one.
My battery was nearly all Catholics, all but 5 or 6, and I had a great many Catholic friends. And anyway, we don't need to have government by sheet. I don't like it. They're no good. I never had anything to do with it. I know of one particular instance when a Negro soldier, a veteran of the Pacific War, was discharged. His home was in North Carolina. And as he tried to go home, he was stopped by one of the police officers down there, sheriff, I think, and he protested that he was just on his way home. They charged him with being drunk and disorderly, and he wasn't drunk at all. But he got hit over the head with the blackjack and hit across the face with a billy club and blinded him for life. Those things happen, but we are always, always ashamed when we hear about them. And it's brought about by this bigoted minority I'm telling you about. When the country gets into a war, the reins are off to save the country at that time. And when the war ends suddenly, as this one did that I'm talking about, it's difficult to get the people to understand that the emergency has passed and they must go back to a normal way of life and remember that the law enforcement authority is of no value unless the people are behind that law enforcement authority. And I think that's usually the case. I've found it so, and nobody's had more experience with it than I have, and I'm bragging a little bit when I say that, but I spent 10 of the best years of my life in the Senate of the United States and 8 years in the White House, and I know what I'm talking about. I've had experience with people. I had a bunch of Negroes come to see me while I was in the White House, talking to me about implementing the Civil Rights Bill, particularly as it affected the anti-lynching bill, it was called at that time. And I had a long conversation with them. And when they left, they found out that they were talking to somebody who was pulling every string he possibly could and using every means at his command and all the authority he had to get the civil rights thing implemented.
On the screen is the library, the Harry Truman Library in Independence, Missouri. It's just a short distance from where he lived, and he walked to work every day. And Sam Richet, you have something to show us?
Yes, I do, Brian. As Mr. Truman pointed out, civil rights was a very divisive issue in the early post-war period. And what I'd like to show you here is an example of I think it's a very interesting document concerning civil rights and the effect that it had on Truman and on the Democratic Party, which was split as a result of the civil rights issue. Strom Thurmond ended up running as a states' rights candidate in 1948, largely because of the civil rights issue. So Truman, this is before the 1948 election. This is before he is safely reelected. He has created a committee on civil rights, which had some very far-reaching proposals, and he had just recently integrated the military through an executive order that he had passed, 9981. This letter, I think, is very, very interesting because it's Truman's reaction to a friend that had written him a letter. His friend was named Ernie Roberts. And Mr. Roberts, I think, in his letter really expressed the sentiments of many white Southerners on the civil rights issue. And using actually quite racist language, Mr. Roberts had said basically, let the South take care of African Americans. He did not use that term. And basically appealed to Truman as a fellow Southerner and said, you know, you're endangering your re-election chances. You know, you might lose the election if you alienate the South with your civil rights program. I'd just like to read you a little bit of this letter. Third paragraph. The main difficulty with the South is that they are living 80 years behind the times, and the sooner that they come out of it, the better it will be for the country and themselves. I am not asking for social equality because no such thing exists. But I am asking for equality of opportunity for all human beings. And as long as I am here, as long as I stay here, I'm going to continue that fight. And then at the bottom of the letter he says, I'm going to try to remedy it, that is the civil rights problems. And if that ends up in my failure to be reelected, that failure will be in good cause. So I think it's a fascinating letter.
Thanks for that. And if you want to read the entire letter and President Truman's response, you can find it on our website, cspan.org, but you can look for presidential libraries. There's lots of material there. It also connects you to the Truman Library site. Richard, President Bill Clinton supposedly, I heard the figure the other day, has made about $46 million speaking since he was president. Jerry Ford started it by making money for speeches. Ronald Reagan, George Herbert Walker Bush. What about Harry Truman?
Harry Truman did not speak for money. Harry Truman, when he left office, there was no pension in those days for presidents. The only guaranteed income he had was about $112 a month on, I believe, a military pension from his World War I service. And this was rectified to some degree. In 1958, Congress passed the Former President's Act and created a $25,000 a year pension. And of course, there were two former presidents alive, good friends, unlikely friends, Herbert Hoover and Harry Truman. Mr. Hoover wasn't going to take it, but he didn't want to embarrass his friend Harry Truman, who by that time, I believe by then, he had actually sold off the family farm in Grandview, Missouri. Was turned into a, guess what? Was turned into a shopping mall. Very post-war affluent. But anyway, Harry Truman was actually reduced to selling off that property, as he said, to stay off relief.
Let's watch some more of the outtakes, and this is about the idea of making a profit off the presidency.
And a president can't promote the fact that he's been president. If he does, he's not in the right frame of mind. And so when I thought about those things, I thought about other presidents who had been through the same program that I had, and it was interesting as could be. Some of them, when they became presidents, were rich men. Some of them were just in the same financial situation that I was myself. And those men who had to go ahead and do what was necessary to make a living did not, under any circumstances, use the fact that they had been president to promote their own welfare and benefit. And that's one of the great assets that the country's had. Presidents of the United States are men who understand what it means to be the chief executive of the greatest country in the history of the world, and that's all there is to it.
I had offers from, half a dozen people who wanted to pay me a great big salary. One in particular told me that he would like to give me $100,000 a year to be chairman of a board of his organization. And I said to him, why didn't you make that offer to me when I was working out on the farm for 10 years? I'd have been happy to have it. And then he left. He knew very well where I'd put him. He was trying to exploit the presidency of the United States, and that I wouldn't stand for.
One last video clip before we get into the phones again. This is daughter Margaret. Where is it?
It's at the Truman home. The first time, actually, they allowed cameras in there. Harry Truman once observed that three things ruin a man: power, money, and women. He said, I never wanted power, I never had money, and the only woman is up at the house right now, and you're about to meet her. We haven't talked very much about Bess Truman, who is, in fact, a significant part of this story. But if you want to know why Harry Truman was grounded, take a look at this clip.
Harry S. Truman is a former president of the United States. He spent almost 20 years in Washington as senator, vice president, and president. He loves politics and people, particularly Democrats. Since the Trumans left Washington, I've been living in New York, but our family home is where it always has been, in Independence, Missouri. This is where we live. It's a rather rambling Victorian-type house. It was built 89 years ago, shortly after Abraham Lincoln died. It has 12 rooms, stands on a corner at North Delaware Street and Truman Road, about a half acre in all. We've never had cameras in the house before, but I hope they're working tonight. Good evening, Mrs. Truman.
Good evening, Marge.
Good evening, Mr. Truman.
How are you, Maggie?
Oh, no fair. Where's Vieta?
Oh, she's in the kitchen.
Oh. You see, Vieta Garr knew me before I knew her. I was 3 years old when she came to work with us. She raised me, too. Hi, Petey. How are you?
Fine. You?
Fine.
Are they still on?
Good. I must tell everyone that Vieta spent 8 years at the White House as sort of master cook of bread and rolls. Someone asked me the other day if you liked living at the White House.
I most certainly did.
Mm-hmm. What'd you like most?
Well, I liked getting around and meeting all the big people, all the pomp and show.
Everyone who's dropped by the house in recent years knows we have a big iron fence around the property with a gate that opens only when we push a button in the house. Dad?
Yes?
Why don't you explain why you have that fence up?
Well, the fence had to be put up to keep the American propensity for collecting souvenirs from tearing the house down. I was told by that when Herbert Hoover went to Washington as president, they took the doorknobs off his house and almost tore the house down before they placed the guards there to prevent it. And the Secret Service decided that the fence would be necessary to save our property from being destroyed.
Now, I'm delighted it's there.
A story that Americans like souvenirs.
Mm-hmm.
When I was in the First World War, if I remember correctly, it was said that the British fought for the control of the seas, the French fought for the freedom of France, and Americans fought for souvenirs, and they're still fighting for them.
That's right. Daddy,
Yes?
brace yourself.
What for?
I'm frequently asked what kind of work, manual work that is, you do around the house.
Oh, I do an immense amount of it from a rocking chair.
Uh-huh. And how many times have you mowed the lawn in the past few years?
Well, as I remember, I think about once.
Uh-huh. That right, Mother?
I don't remember the once.
Ah, that's what I thought.
Picture on the screen is from his working office at the library. Richard Norton Smith, when you see former President Truman, he never stops moving.
That's right.
In the
Oiled energy.
Huh?
I mean, you know, I'm glad we saw that clip because it's about 8 years earlier than what we're seeing from the Decision series. And he seems much younger. But you're right, he's in constant motion.
It's time for us to once again go to the phones. The numbers will be up on the screen. You can begin dialing right now, and we'll get you on here. We only have a couple minutes left in the program, but we want to hear your questions or even your comments on what you've seen. Michael Devine, anything else in that working office that you want to point out to us before we take a call?
Well, just let me say that one thing we don't have in the working office is the famous "Buck Stops Here" sign. That was in Truman's White House office, and we have it on display here in our library. On the back of that sign, the front said "The buck stops here." On the back, there was another message. It said, "I'm from Missouri." And Truman felt he needed to be reminded that he came from Missouri, and that's where he planned to return once his public service in the White House was over. But he really didn't need any reminder. I mean, he was a Missourian. There was never any question in his mind that he would return to independence, where his friends, his home, the courthouse where he'd served as county judge, where all these things existed and exist today and are available to the public.
Marietta, Ohio is on the line. Go ahead, Marietta. You're on the air. Go ahead, please.
Hi. First, I just want to say thank you for letting me be on here. My question is, if you guys could talk about, or if there's anything at the library concerning General Marshall, because I know Harry Truman was a great admirer of General Marshall, and I was curious if there was anything, or if Mr. Norton could explain if anything from the point of view of General Marshall, because I know they talk about Harry Truman being a great admirer of Mr. Marshall, but they don't really say anything about the point of view of Mr. Marshall towards Harry Truman.
Mr. Smith.
Well, they were mutual admirers, and in fact, Harry Truman didn't have a lot of heroes, but there's no doubt that he regarded George Catwett Marshall as the greatest living American. And there's a remarkable story. Marshall finally got to retire, he thought, as chief of staff, and he got in the car. He had his retirement ceremony at the Pentagon, and he drove out to Leesburg to the home that he and Mrs. Marshall had planned for their retirement years. And he walked in the house, the phone was ringing, and it was Harry Truman calling him out of his retirement, which had lasted all of about 3 hours, sending him to China in a doomed attempt to try to negotiate some kind of settlement between Mao Zedong's communists and Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists. And of course, later on, he became Secretary of State, and then still later, Secretary of Defense.
St. Louis, Missouri, you're on.
Yes, I'm trying to find, I've always admired Harry Truman, and I'm trying to find out how much did he take from the other members of the Democratic Party when he did sign the executive order integrating the military.
Michael Devine, did you understand that?
Right. As I understand the question, certainly his decision to desegregate the military and integrate the federal bureaucracy as well with executive orders did lead to a split in the Democratic Party and the walkout of the Dixiecrats led by Strom Thurmond. This is why many people in 1948 wrote Truman off. The party had split three ways: the extreme liberal wing under former Vice President and former Secretary of Agriculture Henry Wallace, the conservative Southern wing of the party with the Dixiecrats and Strom Thurmond, but Truman managed to hold the core of the party together and win a sizable victory.
Next call is Coleman, Alabama. You're on the air. Go ahead, please.
Hello. I just wanted to make a comment about the term, the N-word. In those days, I mean, prior to the 60s, it would have been unheard of and extremely rude to have called a Negro a black person. That only started in the 60s, and if you listen closely, he used the same word that we used in Alabama, a courteous word. He didn't say Negro, he said Negra, and that's what we call them, Negroes or colored people. We'd never say anything like black. That would have been rude, and I'm sure it was actually the same everywhere. It was only in the 60s that this term came up that, you know, they wanted to be called black people, and so we started calling them black people.
Thanks, caller. Let's go to Honolulu, Hawaii. You're on the air.
Yeah, I just have a comment about where is our Harry Truman of today. We could surely use a guy like him again. Give him hell, Harry.
Next call, Columbia, Maryland.
Yes, hello. I was concerned. I'm watching the gentleman in the archives library, and he's not wearing cotton gloves, and I thought that was kind of necessary to preserve the integrity of the documents.
Sam Richey.
That's a very fair question, and there's been a lot of conversation about that in the National Archives about what's the proper method for handling documents. The most recent guidance that we have received from our preservation authorities at the National Archives is that cotton gloves are not regarded as necessary to handle documents. They are regarded as necessary when handling museum objects. So it's a matter of practice. In some places, people do use them. However, some people are uncomfortable using them because there's the danger that having cotton gloves and handling the originals, you don't get quite the good feel, and you could possibly rip or tear accidentally the document. What we try to do is not handle originals whenever possible. What we normally do is we provide photocopies for researchers. And the other part is we try to put as many documents up on our website as we can because we are very aware of the fragile nature of original documents. But I think you'll notice that in this program and in the two preceding programs, the archivists that were handling the documents also were not wearing gloves. But it's an area of sensitivity and some discussion, but the most recent guidance we have is that it's not necessary.
Sam Richey, how long have you been at the library?
I've worked at the National Archives, Brian, since 1993, and I've been with the Truman Library 4 of those years.
Fort Myers, Florida. Go ahead, please.
Thank you for taking my call. I appreciate your programs very much. I watch them all the time. I was wondering what the Presidential Library might have in way of information on the displaced persons from the concentration camps being allowed to come into this country under Truman's administration, whereas during Roosevelt's administration they were turned away.
Mike Devine.
Truman very aggressively sought to change American immigration law after World War II. He was very concerned about the number of displaced persons throughout Europe and wanted the United States to bring in much larger numbers than Congress would allow. I think many members of Congress felt that if the gates opened up to immigration, that the unemployment of the Depression era might return and Americans would be out of jobs and this sort of thing. Truman, in a number of instances, said he felt America needed the new blood and the vigor and vitality that immigrants had always brought to the American society. He did change immigration law drastically. Chinese exclusion was done away with. Oriental peoples could immigrate to the United States as well. There was a quota system still in place, and Truman was unable to persuade Congress to loosen up on that. But certainly many more refugees, displaced persons came into the United States because of Truman's efforts than would have been the case otherwise.
Sam Richey and Mike Devine out at the Truman Library. Here in our studios, Richard Norton Smith, who has run the Hoover, Eisenhower, Ford, Reagan, and Lincoln libraries, even though the Lincoln Library is not a part of the presidential, the archives, and also built the Dole Center for Politics out at the University of Kansas. Let's go to St. Augustine, Florida. You're on the air. Please turn down your television set, put it on mute, and keep talking. Going to have to keep moving if you don't. Let's go to Washington, Indiana. You're on the air, Washington.
Yes, was interesting to hear, I think it was Plain Speaking was a book that was written about Mr. Truman a few years ago, and it was well before Watergate, and I thought it was interesting his impression of Richard Nixon. I believe he even called him a crook, and I was kind of curious to see what the gentleman there thought about that.
Mr. Smith?
Well, that is an interesting relationship. In 1952, well, certainly Harry Truman never forgave Nixon. He thought Nixon called him a traitor. Now, interestingly enough, in the last year or so of Truman's life, Richard Nixon, then president, came to independence. I believe, again, Mike can correct me, I believe he brought the piano from the White House as almost a peace offering, and he sat down to play what he thought was Mr. Truman's favorite song. And, of course, it was the Missouri Waltz, which Mr. Truman cordially despised. But by that time, he was too deaf to hear. But the relationship, there's no doubt Harry Truman always believed that Richard Nixon was unworthy of the presidency. And although they were certainly cordial to each other that day, well, there's no doubt that, that he never forgave Nixon. In 1960, for example, I think he was more against Richard Nixon than he was for John F. Kennedy. It made it very easy during the primary, the Democratic primary campaign. He had famously talked about it wasn't the Pope he was afraid of, it was the Pop, i.e. Ambassador Joseph Kennedy. But once Kennedy was nominated, it became very easy for Mr. Truman to fall into line because Kennedy's opponent was Richard Nixon. And he told one audience, in fact, that fall, he said, if you vote for Richard Nixon, you deserve to go to hell.
Our director tonight here at the C-SPAN studios is Greg Sizowitz. Our next call is from College Station, Texas. You're on the air.
Yes, good evening. I would like for someone to discuss his membership in the Freemasonry movement. I understand he was a 33rd degree Freemason, and that to his death that he kept a special poem in his wallet that he would share with people. Would y'all please comment on that?
Michael Devine.
Yes, during his young adult years, Truman was a great joiner of clubs, social organizations, including the Masons, and he did work his way up the ranks to become a 33rd degree Mason. He was very proud of his membership in the Masons, and as he was with other organizations as well. He did keep a poem in his wallet that was by Tennyson, the great British poet, called Locksley Hall, in which one of the stanzas of the poem referred to the brotherhood of man and the parliament of the world. Truman felt that one of the great tragedies in world history was the failure of the United States to join the League of Nations, and he saw the creation of the United Nations as a second chance at having a world organization that would help promote world peace. And the poem apparently meant so much to Truman that he did keep it in his wallet throughout his life.
Plains.
I would just like to
go ahead.
May I just add just
sure.
a quick comment to Michael's point, And before I do that, I've been told you're interested in my tie, Brian. Can I say something? Can we show
I
the
didn't
the
say a
audience
word
my
about your
please?
tie, but go right ahead, Sam.
Okay. I would like to shamelessly promote our gift shop at the Truman Library, where I bought this Truman tie. It's my favorite tie, and it's available for sale at our gift shop, and it is also available on our website.
How much?
The point I believe it's around $24.
Nice. Go ahead, Sam.
Thank you. It even has the results of the election on it. I just wanted to add to Michael's point about Truman's involvement in the Masons. He joined the Masons at a young age. I believe it was in 1905, and joined the Belton Lodge in Missouri. And yes, he did rise to be a 33rd degree Mason, which I believe is the highest rank that any president had achieved. I think Warren Harding may have been nominated to the 33rd degree, but died before he received it. But the cornerstone of the Truman Library was laid with a masonry trowel, and the Truman did receive a masonry funeral, a Mason funeral when he died.
Plain City, Ohio. Next call. Go ahead, please.
I was wondering if you could talk about how President Truman renovated the White House, and I think I read somewhere that he actually stayed someplace else during his time as president. And just maybe talk a little bit about that.
Mr. Smith.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I remember President Ford telling me he was a freshman congressman in 1949, and he went down to the White House one day and was given a tour through the whole place, which was clearly falling down. I mean, the piano leg was about to come through the floor, and one corner of the East Room was sagging 18 inches. And anyway, President Truman took the Public Works Committee of the House on a tour of the White House, and he proposed that they not tear down the house, as some were suggesting. They thought that would be cost efficient, but that they gut the interior but keep the walls, and that is exactly what happened. Now, of course, there was also the great controversy because Mr. Truman added a balcony on the south side of the White House, which was by no means universally popular. But during that period of construction, for over 2 years, I think, he actually lived across the street in Blair House, and it was there in 1950, we talk about this eventful presidency, it was there that there was an assassination attempt on his life by Puerto Rican nationalists who actually killed a Secret Service agent or Washington policeman. But Mr. Truman was unscathed.
By the way, the same gentleman that's producing this program, Mark Farkas, is working on an extravaganza on the White House. We'll show you more of the White House than you've ever seen in the spring sometime after the primaries are over. We've been shooting in high def down there, and we'll tell you more about that as time goes on. Before we take another call, here's some more outtakes from the Decision series. This is called A Solitary Meal. We'll be right back with you with more calls.
When you live in the White House, you live pretty high. Sometimes I would have dinner alone, and I'll describe it to you. First, the head butler, Fields, a great big 200-pounder and a fine-looking man, a very fine person, would come in and say, very seriously, "Mr. President, dinner is served." I'd walk into the dining room. Barnett, another of the butlers, was one of my servants, too. Barnett, in tails and white tie, would pull out my chair, push me up to the table, and he looked very, very, very much like the pictures you see of butlers in these high-hat houses. Brings me a fruit cup. Barnett takes away the empty cup. Fields brings me a plate. Barnett brings me a tenderloin. Fields brings me an asparagus. Barnett brings me carrots and beets. I have to eat alone and in silence in a candle-lit room. And she don't believe I was getting service. You never saw any.
Let's go to Decatur, Illinois. You're on the air.
Yes, I'd like to find out where the terminology of haricum came from. And, of course, Truman was the only 20th century president to not attend college. And I believe he did get an honorary doctorate degree from Oxford University. But my question is, why was James Polk his favorite president?
Mike Devine?
Well, Truman's favorite presidents tended to be Democrats. In 1948, when Arthur Schlesinger Sr. conducted this, the first poll of historians about who were the great presidents. Someone asked Truman who he thought were the greatest presidents. All of them were Democrats. Now, his favorite, my understanding was always that it was Andrew Jackson, that Jackson was one of his great heroes, not only because of his military career, but, of course, Truman served as the presiding judge of Jackson County. But Jackson was a Democrat. Truman placed Grover Cleveland ahead of Abraham Lincoln. In fact, Lincoln turned up 8th in Truman's assessment. George Washington was up there at the top, along with Franklin Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson as well.
Let's go to Flint, Michigan next. Good evening.
Good evening. In the last 5 or 10 years, some books have been written about Harry Truman's decision to drop the atomic bomb, and they suggest that, gee, the Japanese were ready to surrender before the first bomb, and that the United States, after dropping the first bomb, the Japanese were going to go ahead and surrender. But their viewpoint is really kind of sinister in that America wanted to drop the second and the third bombs to see how the bombs would work, see how they would really hurt all the people. And the thrust of their whole story is that, this was all unnecessary, and the Japanese were going to surrender anyways, and it's just terrible that America dropped these bombs in the first place, because if we just would have continued the war effort, you guys showed some maps earlier from the war room, that the United States could have defeated Japan without any major cost in lives, without dropping the atomic bombs. What's your view on that?
Mr. Smith.
Well, it's ironic that there's much more debate now about the decision to drop the bombs than there was at the time. First of all, again, remember the context of that time. This didn't exist in a vacuum. We had just come through a ferocious battle on the island of Okinawa, which suggested that the Japanese were in absolutely no mood to surrender. You had, of course, the kamikazes going on at sea. There was, in effect, kamikaze armies on Okinawa and other islands as well. And there were estimates that an actual invasion of the Japanese homeland could cost 500,000 American lives. And then the other, very quickly, the element was, do we keep the emperor? That was one of the elements that was being debated. But there's really no evidence, then or now, that the Japanese were prepared to meet the unconditional surrender demands of the Allies.
Timonium, Maryland, you're our last caller.
Yes, good evening. My question is for Mr. Smith. I just finished reading the book Truman by David McCullough. I thought the book was somewhat patronizing, and I wondered what his view would be of that book.
Thanks.
Oh, gosh, you're asking the wrong person. I'm a big McCullough fan. And I think, I don't know, have you read John Adams?
He's not on there.
Okay. David writes about people he likes, and he makes them likable. And I think it's an extraordinary impact that one book can have. I think that book probably has done more than anything else to reintroduce Harry Truman to millions of Americans who never knew him while he was alive.
Truman Library archivist Sam Ruchet, you have one last document for us?
Yes, Brian, I do. It's my pleasure to show again a new item, a new document that we're opening this evening for the first time. Again, this is another one of the George Elzey donations. Elzey being the White House assistant to President Truman and a speechwriter. He's the same fellow who gave us the vote tally that we showed at the very beginning of the program. And it's my pleasure to show you this document because I think it sort of wraps up this program well. It contains Harry Truman's handwritten reflections on his legacy and his concern about his place in history. And he's writing this to George Elzey because Elzey is a trusted advisor, and Elzey is also involved in the planning for the Harry S. Truman Library, which would be dedicated a few years after Truman left office. He writes to George, "The lies are beginning to be solidified and made into historical facts," in quotes. "Let's head them off now while we can. The truth is all I want for history. If I appear in a bad light when we have the truth, that's just too bad. We must take it." It's interesting that this document is dated February of 1950, just about a year and a half or so into Truman's, less than half a year, a little over a year after Truman took office for a second term. And so it's fairly early into his second term, but this comes at a time when Senator Joseph McCarthy has made his allegations about communists in government. And the communists and government issue is beginning to really take root with the Alger Hiss conviction the month before. And so Truman is under increasing fire over that issue. And this is even before the Korean War has even begun. So Truman was a man under fire very shortly after he assumed his second term. And here he's very, very cognizant of his lasting legacy and what that would be.
We're out of time, and I want to thank Michael Devine and all of his people out there at the library in Independence for all your help in this. And thanks for joining us tonight from President Truman's office there in the library. And Sam Richey, who is the supervisory archivist, and Richard Norton-Smith, who has been our consultant on this project very much, and Eric Nelson, who did all the difficult work out in the libraries looking for. We have a lot more to go in the series. We have 3 down and 12 total, another 9 to go. Next week it'll be Eisenhower. And thank you all very much for joining us. One last clip.
Bring your speech to its conclusion now. We've finished the question period, and would you then conclude your remarks?
Well, I'm very happy that you've been here, and I sincerely hope that when you go through the institution back here, which is set up for a study of the government of the United States, that you find something of vital interest to you and something you can take home with you and consider, because the next generation is going to be in your hands, and it's going to be up to you. The old people like myself have tried to do their part. Now it's up to you to continue it and make this government continue as it has always been from 1789, the greatest government in the history of the world.
The C-SPAN series, Presidential Libraries. The C-SPAN series, Presidential Libraries, History Uncovered, visits the Harry S. Truman Presidential Library in Independence, Missouri, and explores the career of our 33rd president.
He'll always be Mr. President to us. He's home folks to us. We're glad to have him, and we're glad to have all of you here to greet him tonight. Welcome home, neighbor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. I can't tell you how very much Mrs. Truman and I appreciate this reception. It is magnificent. I never expected it. Therefore, it's more to the heart than I anticipated it would be. There's not much that I can say to you, except that your good feeling and your thought of us is always highly appreciated. We're back home.
For more historic footage and other exclusive materials, go online to our special website at cspan.org/presidential libraries. As part of the Presidential Library series, C-SPAN Radio will bring you never-before-aired selections of audio-taped interviews with Harry Truman, conducted by historian and author Merle Miller. That's tomorrow at 3 p.m. Eastern on C-SPAN Radio. And next Friday, we'll be live from the Eisenhower Presidential Library in Abilene, Kansas. Dwight D. Eisenhower was the first president to use television extensively to communicate with the American public. And during the 2-hour program, we'll examine his use of that emerging medium through archival film recordings. We'll also look at letters, documents, and artifacts from the stacks and vaults of the library. And we'll take your calls next Friday at